Please introduce yourself and briefly summarize your education and professional background.
Hi, I'm Rucker Simon with Walter P. Moore. I'm a professional engineer and I'm the managing director of our Civil Houston group there. I graduated from Rice University in 2014 with a bachelor's in civil and environmental engineering. I actually focused in hydraulics and hydrology, but moved into site development as soon as I joined Walter P. Moore, which I joined as an intern back in 2013. So since that time, I've gone from being an intern to a project manager to a team leader, and I'm now principal and managing director there. I also lead our sustainable design community of practice for our infrastructure group. That kind of spans everything from water resources to civil to traffic, everything within infrastructure, and get involved in all kinds of things within the industry as well over the course of that time. Primarily focused in sustainability. I've worked with the West Houston Association, Gulf Coast Green, the ACEC Leadership Academy, Central Houston Engineering Change Lab, all these sort of forward thinking and institutions that kind of drive forward thought within the industry. I've got a passion for education and leadership within education. I work with some local universities and actually universities all over in their curriculum for senior design. I've guest lectured with the Penn Architecture School, the senior design course for civil engineering at Howard University and at Rice University. So lots of stuff all over the place over the past, I guess, 14 or 15 years now, focused in infrastructure sustainability.
Okay, thanks. That is a very thorough background, so I don't think I need to follow up with anything else. So let's get right to this report. Let's get right to this report that I want to talk about. It is called the Living with Water: Insights into Impact and Resilience. We're going to get into some details, but let's start with something I saw as kind of a mission statement. It says it is called a Stewardship Report. And what does that mean?
That's a good question. I think to really understand that, we have to understand what stewardship means. So sometimes these things can be used interchangeably with sustainability or resilience, but stewardship is more about understanding the impact that we have with the work that we do, how it affects our communities, and paying attention to the way that we achieve the outcomes that we try to achieve with our work. So stewardship is not just about sustainability, it's about understanding process and context, and then taking ownership of both the outcomes and the approach to ask the question, what are we trying to achieve, and are we achieving that in the right way? And so when we look at sustainability as sort of an idea within stewardship, that's kind of where things start. That's sort of a surface level idea. But stewardship is more about the ethos of approach, right? It's one of our 5 coordinates at Walter P. Moore, where we're trying to ask the question, are we going about this in the right way? Are we achieving the outcomes that are beneficial for everyone? And are we doing that in the right way? And that's why this report is called a stewardship report, because it's not just about developing sustainable outcomes. It's about understanding context. It's about understanding impact, and about taking our place within that broader context, and making sure to operate in a way that's beneficial for everybody.
Okay, so do you think that stewardship referencing kind of influences how this report was designed and laid out, or is that kind of more of a thing for the Walter P. Moore people working on this?
Stewardship is the focus, right? And so it gets a little bit, when we put together a report like this, it gets a little bit easier, because what we're doing is we're just gathering perspectives of all of our experts within the firm with regard, in this instance, to water. Because we have that approach of stewardship, it's really just about telling that story. It's about capturing the perspective that we all have sort of a nuanced perspective on, but from a standpoint of stewardship, and then capturing those stories and putting them together to frame it from a perspective of stewardship, as opposed to just engineering outcomes, which can happen, right?
Okay, that makes sense to me. But now I want to get into the details of the report. And I'll remind you that our audience loves technical details, so feel free to be as technical detail oriented as you'd like. So, what are some of the report's key takeaways, and which parts mean the most to you and why?
That's a great question. So, with this report focused in stewardship and in telling the story around how we do projects or how we approach specific projects, I'd encourage everyone who's more technically minded to go take a look at it, because we do tell these project stories, and there's about 10 of them throughout the report. Um, but the key takeaways are not necessarily a step by step. Here's how to go do a project sustainably or from a standpoint of stewardship. It's more about creating an understanding, about strengthening understanding and awareness and perspective around how we approach engineering. In this case, specifically civil engineering around water stewardship. So the key takeaways are really about understanding and being aware of the way that you operate when you design certain systems. Um, and it's really about encouraging a deliberate and informed approach to water stewardship as those of us who design systems that either that are affected by water or that are trying to distribute or clean or reuse water. Uh, it's about living through that and understanding that water is really not something to be controlled. And this is kind of getting down to the primary takeaway being perspective as opposed to a technical detail, that when you're designing with respect to water, or rather just conscious of water, that it's not necessarily something to be controlled. Water isn't a nuisance, it's a resource. One of the things that we came back to as we were developing this is, how would you be treating water differently if water were gold, or as valuable as gold? Um, and so when you take that perspective, that can spark innovation. That can encourage this deliberate approach to handling water throughout design. And one of the primary goals is really just to contribute to this ongoing conversation about how we treat water within the built environment. So that key takeaway is really to be aware, to read through all of these different stories and kind of see that through line of how it's not a prescriptive measure or a technical detail that you can take and reapply everywhere. It's about using your own creativity and developing your own understanding of the context, and then bringing your own innovation and educational background and expertise to bear in projects that you work on to ensure that they're moving forward in a sustainable way that is being a steward of both resources and of community.
Okay, so you talked about that water being undervalued, and I've heard that a lot, and that, what if it's treated like the price of gold? Is that something that you're trying to convey in this report in particular? Is that something you're working on to daily? Because I think, not just engineers, but the community as a whole really undervalues water.
Yeah. I think undervaluing water is a very complicated question, right? Part of it comes from the fact that it's there. The society that we live in, the places where we tend to settle around fresh, clean water, right? But as technology improves, it allows the development of communities, cities, whatever type of entity you have, that may not be in an area with a perfect balance of what water looks like. And so you end up in situations where you might have no fresh water, very little fresh water, or like way too much, where you're flooding and you have all this excess. And in those instances, you think you undervalue water until you don't have any of it. It's like you don't know what you got till it's gone, right? So when it's not available, the value of it becomes very apparent. And it's easy to forget when it's available. And so this undervalue of water is, I think, a piece of its consistency, that it's always around, that it is a fact of life. And that, until it's unavailable in the form that you need it in, that understanding of value may not be there. Another piece of that is that water is essential to life. It's essential to the way that we operate. When when we supply water equitably to everyone, which is really kind of what a goal is, right? We want everyone to have fresh, clean water. The amount of energy and effort and design that goes into the treatment and distribution of water until it actually hits the tap, in somebody's house, it costs a lot more than it actually costs to the user typically. The water, especially in the area where we operate in Houston, is heavily subsidized, and that's important, right? People need access to water. People need to be able to afford water. At the same time, that can contribute to this sort of undervalue of water. The economic forcing function to conserve, to reuse, isn't necessarily there in every region. You do see some municipalities across the U.S. sort of raising water prices to be more consistent with what it actually costs to distribute and what the monetary and economic value is of each drop. But at the same time, there is this need to get it to everybody, and so it's a really challenging question. I think that the solution to that, whether it's really a solution or not, I think that the perspective that we can take that can help with that is, regardless of what it actually costs from a dollar standpoint, being educated and aware of the water cycle, of what it really takes to get a treated drop from point A to point B, how use of water in your own daily life or in the projects that you design affect the availability of water downstream or within the water cycle. We talk about the water cycle sort of holistically, but really it's the fresh water cycle. How is what you're doing impacting the availability of fresh water? Maybe not completely within your community, but for the guy downstream or next door. So that perspective, that education, is really, I think, a way that we can start to understand the full value of water without necessarily having to assign a specific dollar amount to it to really enlighten everyone.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a great answer. I appreciate that. You refer to this report as a collection of stories, and I noticed that too, that it's not a retelling of some polling or some data interpretation. It's a collection of stories, and you wrote two sections of the report. One's a study from Rice University, and another is kind of the conclusion. Can you get into detail and tell me about the two pieces you wrote, because you should know those intimately?
Yes, I should know those intimately. No, I do know those intimately. I guess the first one. So the report, or rather the article that I wrote about the Rice University water study that we performed, that was really sort of a novel study. I mean, the idea of to give everyone a background, the idea with this was, let's evaluate, all of the sources, all of the demands, identify where we can have some consistency between reuse volumes and available alternative water supply, kind of line up treatment. For those aware, it's like a standard water balance and water mapping study that exists. That's not really the novel part of it. What we did with this report was we took it a step further, and we worked very, very closely with the university. In fact, when we developed the scope for this study, it was in collaboration with the university to ensure that all of the stakeholders were getting exactly what we need. It's also really useful to leverage different perspectives from different points of expertise. Directors of sustainability, campus researchers, utility and maintenance folks, to understand where the problems are and where the demands are. So we crafted the study around that. But as we went through that study, we sort of took a different approach to say, let's not set goals first. Let's understand the system first. And then, instead of setting goals based on our snapshot of that system, let's look 5, 10, 20, 50 years in the future and try to estimate different scenarios about how a campus can grow, what the goals are for student population, for square footage of buildings for research, that kind of thing, and try to estimate and forecast what demand looks like, as well as the interdependency of what reuse volumes look like, and alternative water sources. And in doing that, you end up with this sort of parametric model through time of what types of interventions you can put in now that may generate a certain payback period if you took that snapshot, but that also can scale with a campus as it scales. So I felt that story was really important to tell, not necessarily the outcomes of this study, because those outcomes can be different for whatever it is, from university campus to university campus, or a healthcare campus, like a large healthcare campus, for instance, like the Texas Medical Center, parks, zoos. The concept can apply across any market and across any sort of institution that needs to manage its own water. But the way that we approach that with key stakeholder integration, with trying not to set goals up front, but to understanding how interventions can respond as an entity or an institution scales. And then in addition to that, as it scales, what are the effects of future climate scenarios? Increasing temperatures, increasing intensities of rainfalls, and aligning all of that to the specifics of a place to then back into what's achievable, what's affordable that has the greatest impact, and then set your goals around that. So we developed that scope with Rice University and went through that process with them to develop a really actionable and implementable plan for water resilience across the campus. And that approach is an example of what it means to be a steward, right? It's about the integration of community. It's about the integration of stakeholders. It's thinking about how you do it so that not only are you achieving outcomes that are beneficial, but you're achieving them in a way that is sustainable and that can continue to perform. So, for the Rice article, that was the story where the inspiration really came from. It was like, let's tell that piece of it so that we can educate and inspire and take that approach really at any scale across the board. Telling that story is a little bit easier because it is something that we've done, right? It's a process that we've gone through. Looking towards the other article that I wrote for this, which is a little bit more of a capstone piece to the Stewardship Report, it focuses more on the future of water. That's something that's really difficult to ignore right now. I think the inspiration for that is not only because I'm a little bit of a futurist. I like thinking about what the next steps are, how things change, how we need to plan and react for the things that do change. Even thinking through that, it's like beyond 50 to 100 years, how do we set up future generations for success with the tools that we have now? How do we leverage future technology or what will be available in the future? You start to think really space age sci-fi level with this kind of stuff to be able to project towards the future of water. But a lot of the challenges that we're going to face in the future exist right now, and they're just only going to get worse. The scarcity of water in some regions, or the intensity of rainfall and flooding in other regions, as we go through the years, those things are going to intensify. We also have new technology like data centers and AI that are consuming a whole lot of water, more than we were really prepared for in the short term. And you see that all in the news everywhere, that communities are not necessarily running out or diminishing their fresh water supplies because data centers next to them are utilizing so much of that. Data centers are not going away. This is the new infrastructure, right? Is this piece of it. And so when we look at the future of water, we see a lot of problems now, and things like those data centers are emblematic of new technology, and that we are going to be faced with future challenges that demand more and more water or more and more energy. And so kind of thinking through that is, wow, we're faced with these challenges now. We're going to be faced with them in the future. How do we need to shift our perspective? How do we need to leverage current technologies, or what should we be focusing on developing to be able to address these spikes in demand in the future? It goes even well beyond here, like what we need to do with fresh water supply for data centers. There's going to be something else in the future. There's going to be more pressures, more water scarcity. There's going to be some greater water demand. There's going to be efficiency demands in what we develop, for instance, for space travel. Like there's a lot of possibilities within the future that create the need to expand the use of every drop of water that we have available to us. And so looking at that, it's like, what do we do? How do we think about this? What do we need to do now to prepare ourselves to be educated, to come up with new technologies to withstand those demands in the future? And that was really the inspiration for that article. And what to me was inspiring is thinking through that, because we have some of those challenges now, we also have some of those solutions now. We have ways of treating water, ways of approaching infrastructure that can help to mitigate those dependencies or those spikes or troughs in availability. And those strategies can be scaled to help address issues in the future, right? A big piece of that is like, we need to innovate. We need to take what is on the cutting edge and iterate on it to a point that it's sufficient. And there's also a need, I think, for a shift in paradigm, a jump from the way of doing things to a different way of thinking, a different way of doing things. You think about the Industrial Revolution, or like when you look back through history, the Industrial Revolution, the move to like flight, or the move to space flight and space exploration. And each of these have these categorical shifts in available technology that helps us meet that need. We have to take the same approach in the way that we treat our infrastructure, because the resources that we need to do all of that are only available if we behave as stewards of those resources. Those resources are finite. We have to make sure that we can design and treat them in a way where we can make them last to be able to face any of the challenges that we have in the future. So that article in particular focuses kind of on the near term, but how some of the strategies that we employ in the near term can scale and be applicable in the future. And also just to inspire, like, let's keep at it. Let's keep trying new things. Let's throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks, and then iterate on that so that we can get to a really efficient, functional way of approaching our infrastructure and our protection of our resources.
Okay, those are some great big picture topics, and I can definitely hear your futuristic bent. And for those who want to get the full details, reminder that the report is called "Living with Water: Insights into Impact and Resilience." Walter P. Moore. That should be able to find it in a search. So, in terms of the report, is this primarily geared toward those in the water industry, or could engineers in other fields glean something useful from it, in your opinion?
That's a great question. I think this report's applicable to everyone. It's applicable, of course, to civil engineers, folks that work within infrastructure and in the water industry. But water doesn't stop within that industry. That industry only exists because of all the various individual uses of where we need water. So it's not even just within the architecture, engineering, construction industry that we need to focus on this. The perspective of being a steward of water that we're painting here is within our realm of expertise. But the takeaway of being a steward of water applies across every single thing that anybody wants to do, whether it's engineering or not. I mean, we talked about data centers earlier, but thinking about as you're, if you're a computer engineer, designing those systems in a way where you understand what the water demands are, the cooling demands, how those intersect with mechanical systems and or water cooled systems, and what can you do differently to mitigate the demand on water there. In construction, it's not just about watering plants or tamping down dust during a build. It's embodied water within the materials that we use. Encouraging, for instance, with carbon, we have environmental product data sheets, the EPDs, starting to look at something that has more of an embodied water value associated with it, so that you can understand in everything that you do, there's a bit of carbon and there's a drop of water, and you can start to make informed decisions about the way that you design. Manufacturing uses a ton of water, right? Depending on what the industry is across the board. But when you take an approach of a steward of water, then the way that you're designing your machinery, the way you're designing factories, and the way that water works through those, you can design them in a way to be a little bit more water efficient, in the same that you can design them to be energy efficient. And so I think that this report really applies, across the board, thinking about how we use water in our daily lives to how water is used from whatever it is that you're working on or creating. From the use of, you'll see the joke like on TikTok all the time, where somebody's pretending like they're an AI bot and get asked a question and then they chug a bottle of water and then answer it. That's a joke, but it's kind of accurate, right? And so thinking about what do you really use advanced tools for that do use a lot of water, whether they're digital or physical, and using them in the right way, sparingly, or using them in a way that is really just the most effective, is a perspective that you can have after you kind of take in the idea of this report. So long-winded answer to say it applies to everywhere. It's not narrowly focused on the water infrastructure industry.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, everyone should have a greater awareness of the role and value of water. But I would like to make sure I include a time for advice to the fellow engineering community in these. Could you give some advice that you learned from making this report that you could pass on? Perhaps it's just one practical, real example of something that they could do into what they're doing and to their lives and to their work, that you learned in creating this report.
Yeah, absolutely. I've talked about it a lot today, shifting that perspective, right? But I guess the question's more of, okay, so what's an example of what happens when you do shift that perspective? An example in civil engineering, like in site development, is virtually all sites are going to need to have some form of stormwater detention. If you're developing a site, you're increasing the impervious area, there's additional runoff. You don't want to overload the downstream systems, and so we create detention ponds that restrict that water and hold it for a while. But all that water does is sit there, right? You're being a steward of the existing water systems downstream, mitigating flood impact, all of that. But what more can you do? You have this water sitting there. Batch detention systems are a thing that exist, right? So weather smart systems that can retain water instead of just detain it and slowly let it out means that you can have a pretty vast reservoir of available reclaimed water for use. And if you treat that to certain different degrees, you can reuse it for irrigation, you can use it for non-potable building reuses, cooling tower makeup, toilet flushing, depending on how you treat it, you can use it for a myriad of things. But the key perspective shift there is, I have this water as a resource. It's as valuable as gold. Now, what am I going to do with it? And with a little intervention like a weather smart detention system that can release that in advance of a storm, but otherwise hold it for reuse, is the sort of approach you might take on a project then, or at least idea that you might pitch to a client to say, hey, you can do this and it can save you this much money and also this much water. And also here's all these benefits of it, right? And that's kind of a real example of how shifting perspective can create real outcomes, just by asking the question, just by thinking through it. And that's really the big piece of advice I would give, after kind of going through this process and understanding all the different perspectives that we have in this report, is that when you change that approach, when you change the way of thinking around it, you start to be more creative and be more innovative and think about what else can be done. And really, we as designers are the key to changing the future in that way. And all it takes is that little bit of shift in perspective.
Okay, I think that's some great advice and just what I was looking for. I really like that. So we've had a great conversation, and I think we're going to be able to learn a lot from this. But before I stop recording, is there anything you feel like you want to add that we should definitely get into this session?
We've covered a lot, and I feel like I've really harped on the idea of understanding what it means to be a steward. Um, I think that if you have any questions or ideas, or you want to talk about this kind of stuff, you can always feel free to reach out to me, get at me on LinkedIn, call Walter P. Moore up. We're always happy to talk about this kind of stuff and be out at the forefront of planning and of innovating. This report is actually the third volume of our stewardship report. We've had two of these come out in the past, primarily focused on carbon and embodied carbon and how we approach that within the built environment. But this is a thing that's really key to our core values as a firm and as designers within Walter P. Moore. So there will be more of these as well. So keep an eye out for our next stewardship report, as that'll be coming out in the next year or two.